for this program to two books that are in the library. One of them is called Lincoln's White House, and it's a very readable, very user-friendly, and I found out a lot of things. And this is put out in the Reagan administration by the White House Historical Association, and it's a 2-volume set, and it is very detailed, going from 1800, when the house was first inhabited by John and Abigail Adams, all the way up to the Reagan administration. And I haven't done an update, but it's very, very comprehensive. It could be dry at times, but it's going to take a while, so let me get started right now. Okay, well, first of all, their transitions. Lincoln was born in Kentucky and moved with his parents for a while to Indiana. And eventually, by the time he was 21 in 1830, they were in Illinois, and he would spend the next 31 years of his life here. And this is their home that you can still see today. And it was a very good middle-class home for the mid-19th century, but they were going to move to a whole different scale when they went to Washington, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Now, this is where they were going to. This is an old map of the District of Columbia, and it was created by the states of Maryland and Virginia, and they called it a district because they didn't want the federal government to be under the control of any particular state. And so it's like almost like Switzerland, it's its own thing. And the Lincolns had been here before. He was a congressman from Illinois. That was his first real dab into politics, but he only served 2 years. And it was quite, you know, a long, long trip. Now, this is where they were going to. This was Washington, how it looked in the 1860s. As you can see at the bottom left, there's the Capitol building there. And you can actually see Pennsylvania Avenue going towards the White House. And there are a lot of things there. As it was a very small city, 75,000 residents, which by many city standards of the day was rather puny. My hometown of Brooklyn, New York, which was then a separate city, had over 266,000 people living in it, and it was the third largest city in the nation after New York and Philadelphia. So Washington wasn't really that big a deal yet. Now, I found this newspaper clipping, and this actually wound up in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, but it was a really, not only was it a trip of over 1,600 miles, but they had to make a necessary but very, very dangerous trip through Baltimore. And they actually, Senator William Seward, who later went on to buy Alaska for us, actually got notes that there was a plot. There were people there. Baltimore was so secessionist in their habits that there was literally a mob waiting for him, and they were going to prevent him from taking the oath of office by any means necessary. And what they did is Alan Pinkerton of Pinkerton Detectives, that's the same one, he actually orchestrated this perfect plan to get Lincoln safely to Washington to take his oath of office. And what he did, and this is probably what saved Lincoln's life, he ordered his men to pick up and cut all the telegraph wires leading from Philadelphia so that nobody south of Philadelphia would know which was the president's train, when it was leaving, when it was arriving in Baltimore. And the reason why he had to do this is that back then, very few American cities had a central railroad station where all the trains came in and left. Most railroad lines, they were private companies then, they built their tracks into the city as far as they could go and then build the terminal. And in order for him to get to where he was going, Lincoln had to ride in a carriage from the Camden and Essex Railroad Depot to the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Depot. And there was someone who was going to try to prevent him from doing that, to attack the carriage, to shoot at it. As you could see, this had to be done in the strictest of secrecy because there are very desperate people out there. Yeah. So Lincoln arrived safely and the party settled into Willard's Hotel. There is actually still a Willard's, only it's not that one, but the one you see now is built on the same site. And it was really basically all because of Pinkerton. And I mean, it's Baltimore's case. He sent out his agents to hang around at the cigar saloons, the taverns, here, there, and everywhere, where they picked up chatter that the president-elect was in danger. And it wasn't electronic like we do today, but it still was chatter, rumors, things flying around. Now, this is something we still do when administrations change. The president and the president-elect both meet at the White House and they proceed to the Capitol in order to take the oath of office, which is at 12 noon sharp. I mean, that's when the new president becomes the president of the United States. And this was also a very, very dangerous operation. In order to prepare for it, they arranged for Army sharpshooters to be on the roofs of Pennsylvania Avenue to keep an eye out, to make sure there was nobody hiding up there. They had men in the crowd with conspicuous badges so that people would know that they had some sort of peace officer status, and they were listening to the crowd, watching them. And even the horsemen on either side, they were actually cavalrymen. And what they did is that they jerked the reins of their mounts to make them weave in and out, so that if anyone was missed who had a rifle, and there were no gun sights then, so you had to do it by eye, and they made sure that, you know, nobody could actually get a shot at Lincoln, although it had another effect. Many people who were dying to see, literally dying to see the president on the way, Lincoln, they complained that he was so surrounded that they couldn't get a glimpse of him. And in the days before television, that was a big deal. But he got there, he got the oath of office. Now, while this was happening, there was another government, 11 states that seceded from the Union, and this is formerly Senator Jefferson Davis's inauguration in Montgomery, Alabama, which was the first Confederate capital, and later they moved to Richmond. And on the lower right, this is Lincoln's inauguration. And, you know, he pleaded with Americans. He said they were bound together by the mystic cords of memory. And he asked them to heed the better angels of their nature and to not leave the Union, not cause a war. But I mean, it was, by that time, everybody was so polarized, there was just no going back. Now, here's someone you probably never heard about, but President Buchanan was our only bachelor president. He never, ever married. And so his niece, Harriet, was his hostess. And she was very sad about hearing about the Lincolns, but she still arranged a luncheon for them. And it's usually some sort of obligation. The outgoing presidential family makes some sort of accommodation like that, although not every president does that. And but she was really interesting because she wrote later that she was had heard that Mary Lincoln was very loud and very Western in style, but she didn't have much of a chance to really associate with her because she basically left the house, left the luncheon, went off. And it was a very difficult time for her. And this is how Washington looked when the Lincolns got there. And you could see the dome of the Capitol, because the Capitol had always had a dome, but the old dome, which was designed by Jonathan Bulfinch, was sort of like that. It was a very classically inspired low dome. If you've ever seen pictures of the Pantheon in Rome, it looked something like that. Today, if you go to Boston, you can actually see the State House and see their Bulfinch dome. So to get an idea, but they felt they needed a big reconstruction to make more room for Congress as the country was growing. In fact, actually, the person who supervised adding new wings was actually no other than Senator Jefferson Davis of Mississippi. And as you see below, that's the north portico of the White House. The original White House didn't have the portico. That was added later in the Jackson administration to sort of update the Georgian style exterior and make it a little more, classical style. And this was really quite a task for the Lincolns because it was on a whole different scale. This was the largest private home in North America for 95 years. And it was quite something for them. Now here's two other buildings that they saw. One of them is still there on top. That's the Treasury building. And it's, right there, everyone can see it. And right next to it are the grounds of the White House. And below is what was actually built of the Washington Monument. And it started with great intentions and much acclaim. It was, they had a private fundraising thing. And when they laid the cornerstone, no less a personage than Sarah Polk and former First Lady Dolly Madison were on the podium. And, but the money ran out and that's as far as they got. and then of course, as things moved towards the war, the government was too busy to undertake that. So they had to make a choice. They had to either do the new Capitol Dome or finish the Washington Monument. And finally, after the war ended and by the centennial of 1876, interest was revived and the government finally finished construction in 1884. But when the Lincolns looked out of their south windows, that's what they saw. And of course, this is what entertainment was like in Washington. Ford's and Grover's Theater. I'm sure you know about Ford's, but you didn't know about Grover's. Well, they were both there. And this is where respectable people went. However, there was not always respectability in Washington. And this is Rum Row, very close to the White House on Pennsylvania Avenue. And it had transitioned from small shopkeepers and homeowners to more to gambling parlors, bars, brothels. And of course, when the war happened, it got really so much worse. Now, here's something else that was there. This was Tiber Creek and the Washington Canal. And the Washington Canal, which is the lower picture, went all the way in what is today's National Mall to go from the Capitol building and actually empty into Tiber Creek. And this picture you see upper right, that is a picture that was drawn some 30 years before the Lincolns got there. And it looks very bucolic, but it was a foul, polluted creek that was really very unhelpful to live for. And it was right on the Washington White House grounds, because the present day Constitutional Avenue was actually runs along the south side and heads towards Virginia. That was, they drained Tiber Creek and built it there in the late 1800s. And this is going to loom very large in the Lincoln's life. Well, the war began. He was president for 6 weeks, and he was still trying to get himself sort of acquainted with the job, because he really didn't have most of his experience was in the private sector as a lawyer. He wasn't a party man who went to all the meetings. He was very interested and everything, but except for his time as congressman, that was the only federal government office he ever actually held. And as you see on up top, the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter, which was like the worst mistake they ever made. In response, Lincoln called for 75,000 troops. And of course, it turned out to be much more than that. By the time the war was over 2 million people were involved in this war. Now, this is the settling in person part, because Mary Lincoln, this may be her inaugural gown. If this wasn't the one, this was probably very much like it. And she was much criticized for wearing off the shoulders and a very low cut bodice, because most people thought she was a little too fat, a little too, matronly. And it was generally a style off the shoulder worn by younger women. And that's her cousin, Elizabeth Todd Grimsley. And she accompanied them to Washington and stayed for 6 months. And the very day of the inauguration, they scoured the house from, top to bottom. And she made some very interesting quotes about it. She said that basically only the rooms in the public floor were worth looking to see anything. And she thought that the house in general, the furniture was in poor condition and it looked like it had served under many presidents. Even though the house had been refurbished twice in just a decade, it was a very heavily used house. And Mary said, we have to do something about this. But it did have some things that the Lincolns didn't have. It had gas lighting, it had an actual plumbing, and it had a real furnace, all of which their Springfield home lacked. The Lincolns used stoves for heating, stoves and fireplaces. They had a privy in the back and a water pump in the kitchen, and they got by with oil lamps and candles. And that was how many Americans lived at the time. But it was really funny with the furnace, because it had been built underneath the Blue Room, and they had vents cut into the walls in the Polk administration, and they allowed it to percolate, and it did fairly well under the old first floor. But up above on the second floor, even though heat tends to rise, it wasn't doing a very good job, because one of Lincoln's secretaries wrote to his fiancée saying that it was almost too cold for him to write to her. So they had to endure a lot. And actually, from what I understand from these books, the second floor was in even worse condition furnishing-wise than the first floor. Well, this is what Mrs. Lincoln did. She went to New York and sometimes to Philadelphia and combed through all the stores, because it's customary, and they still do that today. Whenever a new administration comes in, Congress votes them an allocation for any refurbishments that might be necessary. And, sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't. For instance, Mamie Eisenhower didn't get the appropriation because the house had been extensively refurbished in the Truman era. And so everything was still brand new. But they gave Mary $20,000, which was a huge sum, but it didn't prove to be enough for Mary because she went over by a whopping 30%. And even, it got to be almost scandalous proportions that the president was going to pay out of pocket. And he even was very irritated about it. He said, because coming in, he thought everything would do, everything that was there, it's still there. You can sit on it, you can sleep on it. It'll work. That's as far as he was concerned. But Mary had a much different upbringing. Her, family, the Todds, were at the top of the food chain in Lexington, Kentucky. And so they could afford far better than Lincoln had been able to in his early life. And she had what today people would consider to be bipolar disorder. And sometimes the symptoms is to make yourself feel better by buying. It gives you a rush. And she did it. But Lincoln was livid, and he very rarely ever really got that angry. But he said he was not going to spend another penny on this darned old house. But it was smoothed over. Congress voted through quietly some more appropriations to cover it, and by our standards and our money today, Mary had spent some $700,000, and she was much criticized for this because, as one woman wrote to her, that said, "Northern women are rolling bandages and picking lint, and you're doing that." It was the newspaper, every time she walked out of the White House and got on the train to New York or Philadelphia, the papers were right with her, and they reported every store she went to and everything she bought. So it wasn't something you could do quietly. Okay, here's, I have to give you a warning here because these pictures, it seems most everything that exists of the early White House in the form of images were taken years after the Lincolns were there. But they do have a lot of things that they keep, and I have to describe a lot of what you see as Lincoln-ish. And this is the East Room, and down below the Blue Room, which was always meant to be a reception room. And you see how crowded it could get, especially when the war started. Everybody was pouring into this house. And it's interesting because those chandeliers up there, they were installed by Andrew Jackson, and they were originally candle lamps, and they were converted to gas, and they were still in use. They were in use for quite a while. But there was someone, a clerk in the White House named Stoddard, said its paint and furniture require renewal, but so does everything else. So, men are generally clueless about house furnishings. It was so obvious that even this young man noticed it. And these are the red and the green rooms, and the red is at the top. And Mary liked this room very much. She used to actually read newspapers there. They would entertain personal friends there. Below the green room, that was sort of interesting. It was originally designed to be a common room, or basically a room with no particular purpose. And it was used as a bedroom, a dining room. President Monroe made it a card room. And he's the first one who ever referred to it as being green. And so it's been green ever since. And these are the Lincoln bedroom, which I say amongst the public, it's probably the most famous room in the house in the private quarters. And lower right is how it looks today. But as you can see up the other picture, it was mostly used as an office. Lincoln himself used that room as an office. And it's changed because it was in the southeast corner in one administration, and Jacqueline Kennedy moved it to the northeast corner. However, the pieces were brought by Mary Lincoln, so they were used. That's a definite. And this is the treaty room and the library. And when Jacqueline Kennedy came in and had this massive redecoration project, she felt she had to make some sort of concession to the Victorian period of the house. So while the state rooms downstairs sort of reflect our early republic, roughly the styles from 1790 to 1830, upstairs, which the public doesn't see except in pictures, or if you're lucky enough to be invited, you'll actually see these things. And the treaty room was where Lincoln actually signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And these were dressing rooms. Basically, the early White House had no bathrooms at all. They had a few discreet water closets tucked here and there, and they had to be cleaned out regularly by the servants. And the top one is in the Victorian style. It was used for various purposes. One administration used it as a sewing room for the White House seamstresses. And actually, Eleanor Roosevelt and her successor, Bess Truman, they used their bedroom as an office, and they both slept in this very tiny little anteroom off to the side. And this black and white picture, I actually used to take people, show them that these are White House pieces that the government sold, and the Brooklyn Museum acquired them. And so they made a typical dressing room of the Lincoln mid-Victorian period. And you see the gas lights, the shelves, the pitcher where you could wash and shave, the big mirror. And that's what they did. And of course, the kitchen was really very important. And up until 1850, they were still using, for 50 years, they were using the original fireplaces to cook the meals. And when Mary got there, she was very, very good at household management. And the staff was very, very aware that she knew her way around a house and a kitchen. And she actually moved the location of the kitchen to where you see it here. Nobody knows exactly the reason why, but they believe it was felt that there was better natural light, because it was in the basement. It's still in the basement, actually, although it's changed many times. I actually have another program that I gave recently called the American Table, Dining at the White House, and I go into that more thoroughly. And now this is where they got most of their food from, the Center Market, which was closest to the White House. And now this picture was drawn in the 1880s, but it wasn't much different when the Lincolns lived there. And a lot of things came from the local. In fact, this is where Tiber Creek comes in and the Potomac, because the family got ill on eating local Potomac caught shad because the water was so foul by this time. And we'll go into more of that later. Well, here is wartime president's duties, and literally almost every day, and maybe sometimes several times a day, loyal troops would come marching in from Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, wherever, and the president would review them. And so this was quite an important ritual in the Lincoln White House. And if you notice, if you see current pictures of the South Portico, this is what you don't see here. You don't see the porch they built. on the second floor. President Truman included that in the 1948 to 52 renovation, and they did that. Some people still argue about whether they should or should not have, but it's a nice private outdoor space for the president and his family. So I guess it's more good than bad. And the war was even more close to home. These are federal troops occupying the East Room. So they were actually living there. And so their function was somewhat to provide safety for the president and his family. And by our standards, they were dreadfully lax. And because really almost anyone could come in to the White House and ask the president to see them. And one of their other jobs was to keep an eye on tourists to make sure they didn't pick up handy little objects to pocket, which was a real problem. In a later administration, one of the White House seamstresses actually had to cut off the fringe and the East Room draperies because people were snipping off little pieces on their way through in and out of the mansion. So she just removed the fringes altogether and rehung the curtains. And these are troops. They were also quartered in the White House dome. And as you see, there are visitors watching the construction. And Lincoln had a mystical feeling about the dome in his mind. And he was asked many, many times, well, you know, this is very expensive. And, you know, we have supply chain problems. We have labor problems. And maybe we should stop and not do it until the war's over. Because, and also another reason is that there was no guarantee up until late 1863 that the capital of the United States would actually be able to stay there. A Civil War historian wrote a book in the 1960s called The Confederacy Had Won the War, and it became the United States of America, the United States of Dixie, and the new Union capital was moved to Columbus, Ohio. So it was a tremendous leap of faith, but you know, nowadays with presidents and other politicians, they have professional people to apply what we call spin, and in a way, this was a very crude attempt on Lincoln's part because his belief was that if people could see construction, that the dome was proceeding, that means the Union says, we have no intention of going anywhere. We are here. Now, Washington was completely surrounded by military hospitals. And as you see lower right, that's an example of a typical Civil War ward. And a lot of people were there. Louisa May Alcott served there for a few months in Washington as a nurse. Walt Whitman actually went to nurse his brother and, you know, wound up staying for a while. So there were quite a lot of activity. And when she could, and Mrs. Lincoln would go to visit, because, I mean, she was often talked about in a negative fashion, but she did have many good points, and she did really care. And it was not an easy role for her because her brothers were officers in the Confederate Army. She caused a major thing when one of her brothers was killed. She invited her sister-in-law and her niece to live for a while in the White House, and they were brought across the lines, and the press was absolutely brutal for this generous act. And so even her sister-in-law had to concede that I can't really stay here. And she went back home with her daughter. Now, this is very unhealthy location because as you see up right, you see the White House there. Well, see this plain, this is a plain by the Tiber Creek where the Washington Canal emptied into the Potomac. And the Union Army would take spent, broken down cavalry horses and slaughter them right in front of the White House. So with no air conditioning, you had to keep the windows open in the summertime. And they didn't even actually have screens yet. So you could just imagine it, how it was. And it was so bad, the summer White House, that George Templeton Strong, who was someone, a New Yorker who was in the U.S. Sanitary Commission. They were a private organization that provided aid to the Army Medical Corps. He actually begged off a stay at the White House because he actually recorded in his diary that it was as hot and mosquito ridden as it always is. And he actually took an invitation out of town in a more salubrious climate. And this is where the president and his family would live during the summer. 3 miles away, it was space for old soldiers who had fought in previous wars, and they had a small house there, and that's where the family would live. Actually, the only one of the family who didn't live there much was Robert, their oldest son, even though they had a room for him, because first of all, he was in Harvard, so he was spending most of his time in Boston. And then later, by 1864, he was in the Army, and he said he just mostly wasn't there. But this is the children who were there. Up the top is Tad Lincoln, and that's his older brother, Willie. And they actually had the run of the household, and they would actually break into important meetings in his father's office and just be running around bedeviling the servants. And they were both spoiled very, very much by their doting parents, because they had already lost his older brother, Eddie, who died in 1850. And they just treasured them all the more, but they did some really wild stuff. One of the things was they had a pet nanny goat, and they would attach a cart to it and run around the White House screaming at visitors, "Get out of the way!" But it all came to an end in 1862, and this is where Tiber Creek comes in. Both boys fell desperately ill because the creek, being on the White House ground, they had full access to it. Now, they had already had measles from visiting soldiers' camps. They had survived that, but Willie had a more delicate constitution than Tad did, and when they both came down with probably typhoid, Tad survived, but unfortunately Willie did not. But there were some household stalwarts who were a big part of Lincoln's life, and this was Ward Hill Layman, and he was a marshal of the District of Columbia and sort of an unofficial bodyguard. He was a Virginian, and he never went anywhere unless he had a brace of pistols and a knife in order to protect the president. And he took Lincoln's safety far more seriously than Lincoln himself took it, because Lincoln suffered from depression, which in those days they called melancholia. And he was literally tortured by having to run this war and manage it, because one of the servants recalled that he would sit outside of his room at night in his sleep, and he could hear the president moaning in his sleep. I mean, that's pretty bad. And these were Lincoln's secretaries. Both of them are named John. That's John Hay. That's John Nicolay. And both of them wrote letters home. They both had fiancés, and a lot of things came out. And one of the things that came out from John Hay was that both men absolutely despised Mrs. Lincoln, because they both lived on the second floor of the White House. They shared a room, and so there was constant contact. And Hay actually wrote his fiancée this is the nickname they called Mrs. Lincoln. They called her the Hellcat. And Hay wrote that the Hellcat is getting more Hellcatical every day. I mean, and with Mary's overspending problems, one occasion she actually quizzed them on how much grain their horses consumed while they were living in the White House. Like, it tried to find more revenue. And I have actually another program about the White House gardens, and she caused a major scandal with misappropriation of funds that was supposed to go to the White House gardens and shouldn't have. So that was a big thing. Now, these are visitors they couldn't keep out. Back then, there was no civil service, and government jobs were given out to party regulars, people who had gotten people to vote, people who had made speeches for Lincoln and everything. And all these guys there, they thought, hey, you know, the government owes me something. I got this man elected. And by this time, they had already gone to every federal agency and seen everyone who could possibly help them. And everybody in the White House knew that. But they couldn't stop them from coming in. Well, eventually they did. President Theodore Roosevelt literally said, "Out!" And he made it stick. And that, well, of course, they've been replaced by lobbyists, but it's much better regulated now. It was so bad. It was the second floor was, and the whole house was full of these seething mobs of guys asking for a favor of this thing or an appointment of that thing, and some of them were legitimate. There was an old friend of his from Illinois named Hannah Armstrong. She petitioned to have her son, who was ill, to leave the army, and he signed a discharge himself. Well, the secretaries tried, and but not in a meaningful way. Actually, what they should have done, everybody should have sat down and actually set some sort of rules, because basically then you walked in the front door, gave your card to the usher, and you were allowed to stay. There were no organized tours. If you just wanted to see what the Blue Room looked like, you could just walk in and see it. You know, like I said, the whole security of the President's family was just not acceptable today. And of course, you know, you can't think of everything, as we found out in 1963. No matter what you have, there's always some way to get it. And actually, what they did with Lincoln, they should have done with Kennedy. They should have had watchers on the rooftops of the buildings looking for a rifle. And he had a motorcycle escort, but they were going straight along with the limousine instead of going like this and that and that. That might have saved the president's life. But presidents since then have been much, much better protected. And this is an example of the correspondence the White House produced, and it turned into hundreds of thousands of pages. And of course, I guess we've all been hearing about different government papers found in different politicians' homes, including the current president. And they were very fragmented. As near as I can guess, some of the correspondence is in the National Archives where it should be. Some of it is in the Illinois Historical Society. Some of it's in private hands. And it was just, there was no paper control then. It wasn't until the late 19th century where they put what they call a superintendent of documents number, identifying each government paper so they keep some control over it. And they just went all over the place. Just to give you a good example of it, during the Civil War, Florida's governor, who was a man named Milton, served one term, and when the war was over, he went home. He took all of his governor's papers with him to his personal home. And unfortunately, we lost them because that home burned down in 1885. But they just didn't have the same rules we've got now. And these are some important staff people. The top was Thomas Pendel. He was sort of hired to sort of keep company with Tad and make sure he wasn't lonely, because Tad really, really missed Willie. He really got very little chance to meet any kids who were his peers. And that's one of the reasons why he was indulged so much. And a lot of what we know was from him. The man with the beard is William Crook, and he was hired as a policeman. This is the first indication that someone, he was a DC policeman who was taken into the federal service. Excuse me. And he worried a lot about Lincoln's safety, but Lincoln was very, very fatalistic. He felt that if someone was going to kill him, they would succeed. So he really didn't take care of himself. For instance, going to Ford's Theater, he invited the Stantons to be in the box with them, and Stanton not only refused, he said, "Don't go, period." And but he went. And the lady there is Elizabeth Keckley. She had designed Mary Lincoln's gowns. Mary met her on Inauguration Day, and she was a devoted, close confidant to the First Lady, and her devotion even extended to after the war, because in 1867, she accompanied Mary on a fruitless trip to New York to sell her old gowns to raise more money, which was a no-go, because as fine as the clothing was, the silks, the velvets, they were already out of style. I mean, the big round hoops were out, and you know, it just was a no-go. But it shows you how she felt about the First Lady. In fact, Mary actually told her that if her husband wasn't reelected in 1864, they were going to be in a big hole financially. And even as late as February of 1865, she was still ordering furniture. You know, but of course, you know, in her defense, she expected to be there until 1869, and because he did win re-election. It wasn't until, but he had a lot of problems getting that, because in 1862, 1863, a lot of people, I mean, it was just sheer carnage. I mean, in Chancellorsville, I mean, thousands, just one battle, thousands were killed in just 2 weeks. And people were getting tired of the war. And, you know, every president gets blamed for things that they don't always control. And one of them was the supply chain issue. The Army wasn't getting all the things they needed when they needed them. And, but it took time for companies like Goodyear Rubber made rubber syringes for hypodermics. And it took time to convert the war production. It took time to make the product. It took time to transport it and store it. So and he suffered so badly that even though in the 1862 off-year elections, people were so dissatisfied that they lost like almost 20 seats. The Republican Party still had the majority, but it was 55 down from 70 in the Congress. So, you know, Lincoln got shellacked. Of course, there are a lot of major issues going on. And of course, the main thing was the war. 11 states had left, and he was trying desperately to keep 5 border states in the Union. And if you do the math, because there were 34 states when he was inaugurated, Kansas had just come in, and 11 states had left. Basically, if those 5 states had joined the Confederacy, they would have had, it would have been basically 16 against 18 And even though the Union had the greater advantage of population, there might have been enough people for the South to organize a truce. Just let them go. And some people were saying that it's too much, let them go. I mean, we had never experienced a level of death. In fact, there's actually an excellent DVD upstairs called Death in the Civil War about the founding of our national cemetery system. Even people like Clara Barton had a Bureau of Missing Friends, she called it, and people would send inquiries asking about people that they knew who had never come home. And basically 1 in 5 veterans on both sides never came home. And she would try to field requests so that people could sort of find each other. And she actually had it going for about 4 years before she closed it. And I think they reunited something like 20,000 people. So it was a big thing. But if you ever want to see a good video about all this, that's a good one to look at. It is right upstairs. It's called Death in the Civil War. And of course, they'll help you find out the reference desk. But yeah, so the 1864 was a tough election, but what had really put Lincoln over was that the main communication manufacturing sector of the Confederacy was Atlanta. And you, of course, remember, if you've seen Gone with the Wind, that they besieged the city for over 30 days, you know, shelling it constantly, and people had to leave. And finally, if you remember in the movie, the warehouse in Atlanta burning down, well, the Confederates set it on fire. Whatever they couldn't take, they set it on fire. But that was a major, major victory for the Union. And you know, it happened in August. And so by November, people were still feeling good enough about Lincoln to vote for him. And of course, you know, women couldn't vote, but as in the play Our Town, the stage manager says, men voted 21, women vote indirect. So they were a force. And here's Lincoln with his cabinet, and sitting sideways facing him, that was William Seward. That's what he looked like. And they were going, and that was a major shift in strategy. And actually, Lincoln had a good record of receiving prominent Negro freemen, ministers, various other people who had an interest in having him pass this. And that had never been done before. The only Black people in the White House had been servants, some of them free, many of them slaves. People like President John Tyler, he brought his slaves with him. They were the White House staff while he was there. And it was just, in the Civil War series, one historian said they brought it to a higher purpose, the war. And it also had a good effect on morale, because it sort of re-energized the war effort in the North. And it also affected slaves, because, I mean, technically it was a very weak document, because if you were in one of these 5 border states, which were Delaware, Maryland, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri, you could keep your slaves. If you were in an area like New Orleans, which was under federal control, you could keep your slaves. So, I mean, today it would be very mixed, but politically, that's as far as he could do. And it was really remarkable that he at least received people of color to actually plead their case. Now, he had a lot of criticism too, and the Huntsville press often portrayed him as a baboon, because he didn't have the formal education most presidents today have. He never went to college, never even went to what we would consider high school. In some ways, his wife was better educated than because she went to Transylvania Academy in Lexington and was fluent in French. And so that's how they portrayed him, as some sort of baboon, some sort of ape. And this is a letter, someone warning him that there might be an attempt on his life. And Hay and Nicolay actually kept the file, and they constantly brought it to the president's attention. And there was even possibly an assassination attempt when he was riding from Washington to the soldiers' home, because all of a sudden a shot rang out and his horse bolted, and he was able to get back into control by the time he got to the house. So it could have been an accident, some hunter in the wood, some inexperienced soldier, because the place was full of soldiers. But it could also have been an attempt, to kill him. One of the other issues, you probably never heard of it, but it was a big deal then in Minnesota. They called it the Dakota War, and several hundred people were killed. These are some survivors. And if you notice that in the background, see the men standing with guns. And they also had the New York City draft riots, because New York, largest city in the nation, had 800,000 inhabitants, and this was still just Manhattan. The other four boroughs didn't consolidate with New York until 1898, and many of them were Irish. And the reason why they rose up against the draft is that they couldn't beat it. In the North, if you had $300, they would let you hire a substitute to fight in your name, and you could stay home. And so a lot of people took advantage of that, and it was resented. I mean, many of these people were not even citizens, and yet they were pressed into service. And actually, out of this, you still, if you are a resident alien who came into this country legally and joined the armed services, that would be included in the decision for your citizenship. It's a much faster track than everyone else has a chance to do. And they still do that. But this was really bad. I mean, I actually have a New York Times headline, and back in the 19th century, they would have several headlines before you got to the article, and they would say, "Fire and flame in mass conflagration, woe, and misery." And so, and it was so bad, they actually had to take war-weary troops from Gettysburg, the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, and get them up to New York as fast as they could to help put down this insurrection. And while he was doing this, he was also looking ahead to the peace. And he wanted the work on the railroad to be completed, to move forward. And two different rail lines were coming east from California and west from Missouri to try and connect it, which they eventually did in 1869. But unfortunately, this had a major effect on the Plains tribes, because as you see, to get the buffalo off the tracks, they're shooting at them, and they would just leave them there. Whereas the Plains Indians, like the Kiowa and everything, the Sioux, they would hack all the meat off and use the bones, the sinew, everything. Everything was used. Their whole way of life depended on these. And they were so decimated that a lot of the buffalo you see today in like federal parks and everything, some of them actually came from the Bronx Zoo in New York, because that's how badly they were. It got to by the early 20th century. And also the Homestead Act. And basically anyone, and you didn't have to be a citizen, but you didn't have to be here legally. And they're a great resource if you think you may have any ancestors who may have gone west at that time and filed for land, because you could get 160 acres, and all you had to do is pay a small registration fee and live there and work it for 5 years. and you could stay, but this also impacted, this led to the policy of herding all the Plains tribes onto reservations where they could be watched. And, you know, and occasionally the other Indian wars, they would break out and cause problems like the Cheyenne did. And the army would have to put them back. And a lot of people died because of that. Well, finally, inevitably, the South was spent. They made a good effort, and in 1863, they almost possibly pulled it off. That's still debated today. And as you can see by this picture of Lincoln, he had to take in the last week of his life. I mean, the war had aged him tremendously, and yet people who were there at the time, one of them described his face as transfigured with joy. And somebody even showed him a souvenir picture that was taken of Robert E. Lee in uniform with his aides on the day of the surrender. And he said, "It's a good face. I'm glad the war is over at last." So his last week was a very happy one. But of course, we know what happened. You know, finally, and he was supposed to go to Grover's Theater to see Aladdin and his magical lamp. And at the last minute, they decided to play it for its Our American Cousin. And Booth used to keep his mail there. And I mean, he was literally, according to his sister Asia, deranged by the loss of the South. He thought he could, by killing the president, he could re-energize the South's war effort, but there was no war effort. There was no manufacturing, the railroads were gone, everything was burned down, and they just didn't have enough men. But, you know, when you're sort of crazy like that, you don't care. I mean, you do the same negative thing every single time, thinking you'll get a different result. So he knew about it, and he even planned it. What he did is that, he went into the box and he gouged a hole in the wall and bought a stout stick. So when he closed the door behind the President Parker, he stuck the stick in the wall and the door so people wouldn't get in. And that's why you see him after he shot, he had to leap onto the stage. And what was even more, it's just to show you how theatrical this was. He chose a time when there would be only one person on stage. It was an actor named Harry Hawk. And in Our American Cousin, basically the plot is that this untutored American is visiting his shocked English relatives because he's supposed to have inherited a fortune. And at this particular moment, he gets castigated by Lady Montjoy for not knowing the manners of good society. And he replied that, says, "I said, not used to the manners of good society," says, "I know more than you do, you old sock-apologizing man trap." And everybody was, that was the biggest laugh line in the show. And that's when Booth shot the president. I mean, he was attended in the upper gallery. There was a young army surgeon who was watching the play. He was the first doctor to get there, and he pronounced that the wound is mortal. He will not survive. And that's why they couldn't bring him back to the White House. They brought him to a house across the street, which you can still see. And these are what were in Lincoln's pockets. They're still carefully preserved. And as you see, that dollar bill, that $5 bill, that was an innovation used to pay for the war. It was because, believe it or not, before 1862, the government was only authorized to issue coin money. And so individual banks issued their own scrip. And so that actually made it possible. He also set up the beginnings of an actual banking system where a national bank like today's Federal Reserve would be created, and they would funnel money and they would be able to help finance the war. And he also authorized selling $500 million in bonds. So it was a hugely expensive war. I mean, it was probably more than the combined budgets of the United States from 1789 to 1859. And it actually, the true cost of the war actually turned out to be $2.5 billion. I mean, and before the war, the United States debt was 65 million. So, as you know, we're all having our discussions about, the debt limit in the budget and everything today. Well, that war pushed us over the $1 billion mark. And this is a print of him lying in state in the White House. And that's what they still do with a serving president. They're lay in state in the White House, and then they're transported to the Capitol to lie in state there. And Washington had 7 days to mourn Lincoln, and they used so much black to festoon the buildings and to wear black clothing and do everything in black that they had to send a special train to Philadelphia because they ran out of black cloth. Really. And now you see in the corner there, you see a shrouded woman wearing a dress. That's supposed to be Mary Lincoln. However, she didn't actually attend. She was so distraught that she just stayed in her whole room. She didn't actually leave the White House for 6 weeks. And it was really terrible because she was the one who wanted to go see our American cousin. And so I guess on a level, she blamed herself, and she didn't accompany the funeral train back to Illinois or anything. So it was, very, very sad for her, and she never recovered from it. And finally dying in 1882. This is the funeral procession on Pennsylvania Avenue. It was so vast that they actually had to occasionally stop. And it was really stunning because on the train trip back to Springfield, they stopped. It took 20 days and they had 7 public viewings in states, capitals like Harrisburg, Columbus, Indianapolis on the way back, Chicago, and then New York City. The police at the time estimated that 85,000 people marched in it. that is a huge amount of people for those days, but that's how people felt. There's the Lincoln funeral train, and he was with Willie. Willie had been put in a temporary tomb, and believe it or not, he was actually embalmed in the green room. And that's where he was laid out for his school friends and everything. And Mary had no use for that room after that. It didn't have a lot of use. She preferred the red room, but she wouldn't go near it after that. So that is the end of the Lincoln White House. One more slide. That's their home decorated for his funeral in Springfield. Yeah, so if you have any questions, I'll be pleased to receive them.